There is a particular kind of pain that does not come with loud screams or dramatic outbursts, but rather with a quiet, suffocating weight that settles deep inside your chest, making it hard to breathe. It is the kind of pain that comes when the people who are supposed to love you the most look you in the eyes and make it clear that they never considered you part of them at all. That was the kind of pain I felt the moment I realized my own mother had erased me from my sister's wedding like I had never existed in our family in the first place. The moment I arrived at the reception venue, dressed in the elegant deep blue gown I had chosen weeks ago, I was already feeling a strange sense of unease. The grand ballroom was filled with shimmering chandeliers, floral arrangements spilling from silver vases, and guests sipping champagne in perfectly coordinated outfits. Everything was pristine, perfectly curated to reflect the image of a flawless event, an event that apparently did not include me. I approached the check-in table where a sharply dressed attendant was scanning through a list, her expression polite but detached. I gave her my name, my voice steady despite the strange sense of anxiety creeping up my spine. She skimmed through the list with a practiced efficiency, her neatly manicured finger sliding down the page, searching for my name. Then, with a slight furrow of her brow, she looked up at me with something almost like pity in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft, like she was breaking bad news. "Your name isn't on the list." For a brief moment, I thought she had made a mistake. Maybe she had skipped over my name by accident. Maybe there was some kind of clerical error. But as I looked up, my gaze landed on a familiar figure standing just a few feet away, watching the entire exchange with quiet amusement. My mother. She had always been a woman who exuded control, every hair in place, every movement calculated for maximum impact. Her silver dress shimmered under the ballroom lights, the pearls around her neck glistening as she took a deliberate step toward me. There was a smirk on her lips, a glint in her eye that told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. "Did you really think you were invited?" she asked, her voice sweet but dripping with condescension. "Strangers aren't allowed." Strangers. The word sliced through me, sharp and cruel, deliberate in its precision. I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, waiting for the day she would finally just say it outright instead of showing it in 1,000 small ways. And now she had. I could feel the weight of curious stares from other guests as they passed by, watching this little moment unfold like an afterthought, as if my humiliation were just a passing detail in their otherwise perfect evening. My hands curled into fists at my sides, my nails pressing into my palms. There was a sharp sting, but it was nothing compared to the ache building in my chest. For a long time, I had tried to make sense of why my mother resented me, why no matter what I did, it was never enough for her. I had spent years bending over backward, trying to prove my worth in a family that never truly wanted me, a family that had always made it clear that I was an outsider in my own home. And now, here she was, saying the quiet part out loud for the first time. I could have screamed at her, could have demanded answers, could have caused a scene. But what would have been the point? The people in that ballroom would have kept drinking their champagne, kept laughing under the soft hum of the violin quartet, kept pretending they did not see what was happening just a few feet away. My mother would have smiled her polite little smile, tilted her head in mock concern, and told me I was being dramatic as she had done every time before. So instead, I smiled. "Then I'll live like a stranger." And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away. The night air outside was cool against my skin as I stepped out of the hotel, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me. I felt weightless in a way that was almost freeing, as if something inside me had finally given up fighting for a place I was never meant to belong. But even as I stood there, staring at the city lights shimmering in the distance, something deep inside me stirred. A quiet, simmering kind of resolve. I pulled my phone from my clutch, my fingers hovering over the screen. I could have called a friend, could have gone home, could have let this be the final chapter of a story that had been written long before I ever had a say in it. Instead, I did something else. I opened my social media, my fingers moving with steady precision as I typed out a message. Nothing dramatic, nothing desperate, just a simple statement of truth. For those wondering why I won't be posting any pictures from my sister's wedding tonight, it's because I wasn't actually invited. Apparently, I'm a stranger now. so I guess I'll just live like one. I pressed send and watched as the notifications started flooding in almost instantly. Messages of shock, support, outrage. People asking what had happened, offering to meet up, reminding me that family isn't always blood. And then, something else happened. Inside that perfect ballroom, where my mother was no doubt basking in the glow of a carefully curated evening, her phone started ringing. Over and over. A dozen, then 2 dozen, then 50 messages lighting up her screen in rapid succession. Because secrets don't stay secrets when you try to erase someone who isn't willing to disappear. And if I was going to be a stranger in this family, then maybe it was time for them to learn exactly what that meant. There is something strangely poetic about watching a person's carefully curated world start to crack, especially when that person spent years ensuring you were never a part of it. As I walked away from my sister's wedding reception, my mother's condescending smirk still fresh in my mind, I knew she had expected me to crumble under the weight of her cruelty. She had imagined me walking away with my head bowed, my heart heavy, my self-worth shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. But what she had not expected, what she had never considered a possibility, was that I had stopped needing her approval long ago. My feet carried me down the quiet, lamplit sidewalk outside the hotel, the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the pavement the only sound filling the night. I could still hear the muffled music from the ballroom behind me, the distant laughter of guests toasting to a perfect evening built on years of exclusion. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled my phone from my clutch, my notifications still lighting up at an overwhelming pace. Messages from old friends, distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, each one carrying the same sentiment of disbelief, of anger, of support. At first, I hesitated to read them, unsure if I was ready to wade through the emotional flood I had unleashed. But then, curiosity won over hesitation, and I opened the first message at the top of the screen. What the hell? You weren't invited? Are you serious? I recognized the name immediately. Sarah, one of my childhood friends who had once spent countless afternoons at our house, back when I still believed my family was something whole. I scrolled down further, scanning the messages as they poured in. I just saw your post. I thought maybe you didn't come by choice, but now I'm absolutely furious. You deserved better than this. Your mother actually said that to you? At the door? In public? What kind of person does that to their own child? I didn't know how to answer these questions because the truth was, I had spent my entire life asking them myself. I had spent years wondering what I had done to be treated like an outsider, years hoping that if I was patient enough, kind enough, good enough, my mother would finally look at me the way she looked at my sister, with pride, with warmth, with love. But I had been wrong, and tonight had been my final confirmation. I scrolled further, stopping when I saw a message from my cousin Lisa. You need to see this. Call me now. Something about her words sent a chill up my spine, my fingers tightening around my phone as I hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. The phone barely rang once before she picked up, her voice hurried, urgent, and filled with barely contained rage. Thank God you called, she breathed, the sound of clinking glasses and murmuring voices filling the background. I'm still at the reception, and I need you to hear what's happening right now. I exhaled slowly, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. What is it? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Lisa let out a humorless laugh, the sound sharp and edged with frustration. Your mom is losing it. The second your post went up, people started checking their phones, whispering, showing it around. She kept trying to pretend nothing was wrong, but then the questions started rolling in. Apparently, a few of the guests didn't know you weren't invited, and now they're asking her what the hell is going on. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply as a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion settled in my chest. What is she saying? I asked, already knowing the answer before Lisa even spoke. She's doing damage control, of course, Lisa scoffed. She's telling people you were being dramatic, that you knew you weren't invited, that you just wanted attention. But the problem is, some of the guests don't seem to be buying it. A few of them are actually mad. Someone even asked if it was true that she called you a stranger at the door, and when she tried to laugh it off, another guest, your dad's old business partner, I think, just walked away shaking his head. I let the words sink in, feeling the weight of them settle somewhere deep inside me. This was what happened when you built an entire life on a carefully constructed illusion. Eventually, the cracks began to show, and no matter how hard you tried to hold the pieces together, the truth had a way of seeping through the seams. "Do you want me to say something?" Lisa asked, her voice softer now, more cautious. "Because I will. I'll call her out right here in front of everyone if you want me to." For a moment, I considered it. I imagined the scene unfolding in that perfect ballroom. Imagined my mother standing frozen as Lisa exposed every bitter truth she had tried so hard to keep buried. But as tempting as the thought was, I knew that wasn't what I wanted. "No," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "Let her handle the mess she created. Let her sit in it. Let her feel the weight of what she did. I don't need to say anything. She's already watching everything fall apart on her own." Lisa was silent for a moment before she let out a slow exhale. "You're a lot stronger than I would be," she admitted. "But just so you know, there are a lot of people here who aren't happy about this. You're not as alone as you think." Her words made something in my chest tighten, something raw and unfamiliar. Because for so long, I had convinced myself that I was alone in this, that my mother's rejection of me was something I had to bear quietly, that no one would ever truly see it for what it was. But now, people were seeing. People were questioning. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left explaining myself. "Thanks, Lisa," I said, my voice softer now, almost grateful. "Really? Anytime," she replied, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. "I'll call you later if anything else happens. But for now, just know this, whatever she tried to do to you tonight, it's backfiring. And she knows it." As the call ended, I lowered my phone, standing there beneath the glow of the city lights, the cool night air brushing against my skin. For years, I had been the one waiting for my mother to acknowledge me, to validate me, to let me exist in her world. But tonight, for the first time, I realized something. I didn't need her to let me exist. There is a strange sort of clarity that comes when you finally stop waiting for people to love you the way they were supposed to all along. That was the realization settling deep into my bones as I stood outside the wedding venue, my fingers tightening around my phone, the glow of the screen illuminating the flood of messages still pouring in. The sting of my mother's rejection had not faded, but it had shifted into something else, something sharper, something that felt less like heartbreak and more like resolve. I scrolled through the messages, my eyes scanning the names of distant relatives and old family friends, each one carrying a different version of the same question. What happened? Why weren't you invited? Is this really true? It was strange, knowing that people who had smiled at my mother just hours ago, who had toasted to my sister's happiness under the glow of 1,000 tiny chandeliers, were now questioning the very image of family perfection she had tried to construct. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it. "You need to take that post down right now. You're embarrassing yourself." I exhaled slowly, my fingers hovering over the screen as I stared at the message. There was no name attached to it, but I didn't need one. I had read enough of my mother's thinly veiled disapproval over the years to recognize her voice, even in text form. A part of me had expected this moment to come, the moment she would try to take control of the situation, to rewrite the narrative in her favor, to paint me as the unreasonable, ungrateful daughter who had twisted the truth for sympathy. But what she hadn't counted on was the fact that I no longer cared about preserving the illusion she had worked so hard to maintain. I took a deep breath, my fingers moving with steady determination as I typed my response. "You don't get to erase me and then tell me how to react to it. Enjoy the wedding." I hit send without hesitation, my chest tightening with something that was not quite relief, but close enough. The power she had over me, the control she had wielded for so many years, was slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, I had no desire to reach out and hand it back to her. Before I could dwell on the message any longer, my phone vibrated again, this time with a call from Lisa. I answered on the second ring, bracing myself for whatever update she had to give me. "Okay, you are not going to believe this," she said, her voice laced with disbelief and barely contained amusement. "Your mom just stormed out of the ballroom." She grabbed her phone, saw something, and went pale. Then she told your dad to handle things and practically ran to the hallway. I let out a breath, my lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile but held the edges of one. Let me guess, she's trying to do damage control. Oh, without a doubt, Lisa confirmed. And the best part? People noticed. Like, a lot of people. A few of the guests followed her, probably trying to get answers. Whatever is happening, she's losing control of the situation, and she knows it. I leaned against the cool stone wall of the hotel's entrance, the weight of the night pressing down on me, though it no longer felt quite as suffocating as before. Good, I said simply, the word carrying a finality I hadn't expected. There was a pause on Lisa's end before she spoke again, her voice softer this time, more careful. Are you okay? I mean, I know this is a mess, but how are you actually feeling about all of this? I let the question settle in the space between us, taking a moment to really think about it. The truth was, I didn't know how to answer. The hurt was still there, lingering like an old wound that refused to fully heal, but it no longer felt like it was consuming me the way it once had. If anything, I felt free. I think I'm done waiting for them to care, I admitted, my voice quieter than before. And that feels strange. But not in a bad way. Lisa let out a small hum of understanding. That actually makes a lot of sense. You've spent your whole life trying to be part of something that never made space for you. Maybe it's time to stop trying. Maybe it was. Before I could respond, a commotion from inside the hotel lobby caught my attention. I turned just in time to see a familiar figure striding toward the entrance, my father. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he adjusted his tie with deliberate precision, that told me exactly why he was here. I think I have to go, I murmured into the phone, my gaze locked onto my father's approaching form. Lisa picked up on the shift immediately. He found you, didn't he? Yeah, I confirmed. She sighed. All right. Call me later if you need to debrief, or if you need me to come rescue you. I managed a small chuckle despite myself. I'll keep that in mind. As I ended the call, my father came to a stop a few feet away from me, his hands slipping into the pockets of his suit pants as he studied me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. You caused quite a stir tonight, he said finally, his voice even, measured, careful. I tilted my head slightly, crossing my arms over my chest as I met his gaze without flinching. No, I corrected. I just refused to let everyone pretend I didn't exist. He exhaled through his nose, the closest thing to a sigh he would allow himself. You know your mother. She doesn't like things being messy. She likes order, control. Tonight didn't fit into her version of how things were supposed to go. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Right. Because the real problem here is that I didn't just quietly accept being erased. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or something close to it. I never wanted this to happen, he said, his voice softer now. I never wanted you to feel like you weren't part of this family. But you let it happen, I pointed out, my voice calm but unwavering. You let her push me aside for years. You let her decide that I didn't belong. And you never once stopped her. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with all the words that had been left unsaid for far too long. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, his gaze dropping slightly, as if looking anywhere but at me would somehow lessen the weight of my words. For the first time in my life, I realized something. My father may have been the quieter one, the one who never threw cruel words in my direction like my mother did, but in the end, his silence had hurt just as much. There are moments in life when you realize that silence is not just the absence of words, but a choice, a deliberate decision to ignore what should never have been ignored. Standing there outside the wedding venue, staring at my father's carefully neutral expression, I understood that his silence had been just as much of a betrayal as my mother's outright cruelty. He had never once raised his voice to belittle me, never openly mocked me, never called me a stranger to my face. But he had let her do it. Over and over again. And in the end, what was the difference between the one who wielded the knife and the one who watched the bleeding without stepping in? I studied his face, looking for something regret, guilt, understanding, anything that might tell me he knew the part he had played in all of this. But his expression was the same one I had seen my entire life, the quiet, passive patience of a man who had mastered the art of looking past what he didn't want to confront. "You don't have to say anything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside me. "I already know you won't." His jaw tightened slightly, the only indication that my words had struck something in him, but he didn't contradict me. He simply let out a long, slow breath, his gaze shifting to the distant streetlights, as if the answer he was searching for could be found somewhere in the glow of the city beyond us. "It was never supposed to be like this," he murmured finally, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head as I crossed my arms over my chest. "And yet, here we are," I replied, my tone devoid of sympathy. "It didn't get this way on its own, Dad. It became like this because you let it." His eyes flicked back to me then, something unreadable in them, something heavy. "You think I didn't fight for you?" he asked, the first trace of frustration creeping into his voice. "You think I didn't try to change the way she saw you?" I tilted my head slightly, studying him with something close to curiosity. "If you did, I never saw it," I said, my voice unwavering. "And what difference does it make if she never listened?" He exhaled sharply, his hand running through his graying hair, a gesture I had seen him do 1,000 times when he was faced with something uncomfortable. It was the same way he had reacted when my mother dismissed my achievements, when she rolled her eyes at my accomplishments, when she openly favored my sister in ways that were so blatant it would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. "I thought if I kept the peace, things would get better," he admitted, his voice low, almost as if he were confessing it to himself rather than to me. "I thought if I just didn't push too hard, she would come around, that she would eventually see you the way she should have from the beginning." A sharp, bitter edge settled into my chest, the weight of his words pressing against me like a stone. "And how did that work out for me?" I asked, my tone cutting, my patience non-existent. "How did standing by while she pushed me further and further away do anything but tell her that it was okay?" He looked down, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides, but he didn't have an answer. And maybe that was the only answer I needed. For years, I had told myself that my father was different, that he wasn't like my mother, that he had simply been caught between keeping the family together and doing what was right. But standing here, facing him as the truth settled heavily between us, I realized that his passivity had been just as damaging as my mother's cruelty. Because silence, in the end, was just another way of saying, "I won't fight for you." "I know you love me," I said, my voice quieter now, more measured. "But love without action isn't enough. And it never has been." His eyes snapped up to mine, something like pain flashing across his face, but I didn't waver. Maybe if he had been willing to say these things to my mother, if he had been willing to stand beside me instead of behind her, things would have been different. But he hadn't. And they weren't. "She's furious," he admitted after a long pause, his gaze shifting back toward the hotel entrance, where I imagined my mother was still frantically trying to salvage the image she had so carefully crafted. "She thinks you did this to humiliate her." A slow exhale left my lips, a weary sort of amusement curling at the edges of my mouth. "Of course she does," I murmured, shaking my head. "Because in her world, the only thing that matters is how things look, not how they actually are." He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just sighed, his hands slipping back into his pockets as he watched me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted after another long stretch of silence. I held his gaze, my chest tightening as I realized the truth of it. "You can't," I said simply. "Because this isn't something you can patch up with apologies or explanations. This is something that's been breaking for years, and tonight was just the final crack." His face twisted slightly, like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to tell me that things could be different if we just tried harder. But the exhaustion in my voice must have finally sunk in, because he didn't fight me on it. He just nodded slowly, as if he were only just now understanding that this wasn't something that could be undone with carefully chosen words. After a long moment, he let out another breath, his shoulders sinking slightly. "If you leave now," he said, his voice low, careful, "I don't know if she'll ever let you come back." I stared at him for a long time, letting the weight of his words settle between us, letting the finality of them sink in. And then I smiled, a small, quiet smile, one that held more truth than anything I had ever said to him before. "I don't think she ever really let me stay," I said softly. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the glow of the hotel lights, with nothing but the weight of his silence to keep him company. There's a point where you stop looking over your shoulder, stop hoping that the people who hurt you will suddenly realize what they have done. I had spent years waiting for my mother to soften, for my father to intervene, for someone in my family to reach for me before I slipped too far away. But as I walked away from the wedding venue, leaving my father standing in the glow of the hotel's entrance, I realized that moment was never coming. I had been holding on to the illusion of belonging for too long, gripping onto something that had never really existed, and it was time to let it go. The air outside was crisp against my skin, the city buzzing with the sounds of life moving on, uncaring of the small war I had just waged within myself. The streets were lined with cars, some with drivers waiting impatiently, others empty, their occupants lost in the lavish reception that was still unfolding behind me. I spotted a taxi idling near the curb, its headlights casting a dull glow on the pavement, and without hesitation, I raised a hand to flag it down. As I slid into the back seat, my phone vibrated again, the screen lighting up with a new message. For a second, I debated ignoring it, unwilling to invite more of my family's manipulations into a night that had already taken too much from me. But something in me needed to see it, needed to know how deep the damage had gone. The message was from my sister. "You should have just stayed quiet. You ruined everything." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the phone as I reread the words, feeling the sharp sting of them settle deep inside my chest. It was a familiar pain, one I had felt too many times before, being blamed, being dismissed, being treated as though my mere existence was a disruption to their carefully curated world. For years, I had played the role they assigned to me, the quiet afterthought, the one who was easy to overlook, the one who was expected to endure their indifference with silent acceptance. But tonight, I had done something different. Tonight, I had refused to disappear quietly. And that, more than anything, was what had shattered the illusion they had built for themselves. I stared at my sister's message for a long moment, then, without another thought, I deleted it. No response. No explanation. No attempt to justify myself to someone who had never once stood by me. It was time to stop giving them access to the parts of me they had never earned. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his voice calm, detached. "Where to?" I hesitated, the question hanging in the air, heavier than it should have been. Where did I go from here? I had spent so long trying to carve out a space for myself in a family that had no room for me, and now, for the first time, I had to figure out what came next when I finally let them go. After a moment, I gave him my address, the weight of the evening pressing against me as I leaned back against the seat, watching as the city lights blurred past. By the time I reached my apartment, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, my body heavy with the aftermath of everything that had unraveled in a single evening. I unlocked the door, stepping into the quiet stillness of my home, the familiarity of it wrapping around me like a shield against the chaos I had left behind. I dropped my purse onto the kitchen counter, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for a glass of water, my mind still buzzing with the echoes of everything that had been said, everything that had been left unsaid. My phone buzzed again, and for a moment, I almost ignored it, expecting another cutting remark, another desperate attempt at control from my mother or sister. But when I glanced at the screen, my breath caught slightly. It wasn't them. It was Lisa. "Call me when you're home. You're not alone in this, okay?" Something in me cracked at those words, something I hadn't realized I had been holding on to. I had spent so much time believing that family was something I had to chase, something I had to earn, that I had forgotten that love, the real kind, didn't require me to fight for scraps of affection. Without hesitating, I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear as the line rang once, twice. Lisa answered almost immediately, her voice warm, steady. "Hey, you okay?" I let out a slow breath, my grip on the phone tightening slightly. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice quieter than I expected. but I think this was the moment I finally let them go. She was silent for a moment, then I heard her exhale softly. "Good," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "They didn't deserve to keep you in the first place." A lump formed in my throat at her words, the truth of them settling deep into my chest. "I think I needed someone else to say that out loud," I murmured. "Well, then I'll say it again," she said without hesitation. "You deserved better than them. You always have. And you're not alone in this. You have people who actually care about you, people who see you, people who don't make you fight just to be included." I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me, letting myself believe them in a way I never had before. For so long, I had thought family was something I had to hold on to, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it broke me. But tonight, for the first time, I realized that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. There's an extraordinary kind of peace that comes not from making amends, not from forcing relationships to work, but from finally understanding that some things are not meant to be fixed. As I sat curled up on my couch, the glow of the city lights filtering through my window, I found myself staring at my phone, rereading Lisa's message over and over again. "You're not alone in this, okay?" For years, I had equated love with sacrifice, believing that to be part of a family meant enduring whatever wounds they inflicted without complaint. I had convinced myself that if I was just patient enough, quiet enough, forgiving enough, eventually, my mother would love me the way she was supposed to. But tonight had shattered that illusion in a way that could never be pieced back together. And for the first time, I felt no desire to try. I thought about my sister's text, the bitter accusation laced in her words, the way she had so effortlessly placed the blame at my feet. "You ruined everything." I had spent my whole life being careful not to ruin things, not to upset the delicate balance of a family that had never truly wanted me there. I had held my tongue, shrunk myself down, made myself small enough to fit into whatever tiny space they were willing to offer me. But no more. I deleted her message without responding. I wouldn't justify myself anymore. I wouldn't beg for acceptance from people who had never once valued my presence. Let them be angry. Let them whisper. Let them drown in their own illusions. I had spent my entire life waiting for them to see me, to acknowledge me, to let me exist fully within the family I had been born into. But what I had failed to realize, what had taken me far too long to accept, was that I had always existed, with or without their approval. And I didn't need their permission to start living as if I belonged. The sound of another message pulled me from my thoughts. For a moment, my stomach tightened with the familiar dread, expecting another cruel remark, another attempt to guilt me into submission. But when I glanced at my phone, I let out a small breath of relief. Lisa again. "Hey, I know it's late, but I was thinking, how do you feel about brunch tomorrow?" My treat. "You need a reset." A reset. The idea of it was almost laughable, as if one brunch could erase years of hurt, years of being cast aside like an afterthought. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that maybe it wasn't about erasing anything at all. Maybe it was about reclaiming the space I had wasted on people who had never deserved it in the first place. "Brunch sounds perfect," I typed back, my fingers steady, my heart lighter than it had been in years. For so long, I had believed that freedom meant severing all ties, cutting every last thread that connected me to the people who had hurt me. But I was beginning to understand that freedom wasn't about burning everything to the ground. It was about choosing where to place my energy, where to build, where to grow. And I was ready to start growing. If anyone had told me that my mother would go nearly 2 weeks without speaking to me, I might have been surprised. But in reality, I knew her silence was her greatest weapon, her last attempt to make me feel the weight of her disapproval, to remind me that I was the one who had stepped out of line. She had expected me to reach out first, to apologize, to beg for a seat back at the table she had so easily taken away from me. But I didn't. Not once. And when the phone finally rang, when her name finally flashed across my screen in bold letters, I simply stared at it, waiting for that old familiar pull, the one that told me to pick up, to fix things, to smooth over the damage even when I wasn't the one who had caused it. But the pull never came. The phone rang, and eventually it stopped. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing anything. I felt like I was gaining myself. Life has a strange way of continuing, even when you think it's supposed to stop. The pain of that night still lingered, tucked away in the quiet moments when I least expected it. But something else had started to grow in its place, something stronger, something steadier. I had brunch with Lisa every Sunday now, a tradition that had become something more than just a way to escape the weight of my past. It had become a reminder that family was not just the people you were born to, but the people who chose you, the ones who showed up, the ones who saw you even when you weren't trying to be seen. And then, one afternoon, as I was leaving work, I received another message. This time, from my father. I know I don't deserve a response. But I just wanted you to know that I should have done more. I see that now. I stared at the words, my fingers hovering over the screen, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It wasn't a request for forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't an attempt to undo everything that had been done. But it was something. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to respond. Some things weren't mine to fix. Some wounds weren't mine to heal. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, stepping out into the golden glow of the evening sun. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my family to catch up to me.